Shalom. This week in the land of Israel, we are reading Parashat Behar, and in the diaspora, it will be read next week. Of a sudden, as this parsha begins, we are leaving off the basic subject matter that the entire book of Leviticus has been dealing with so far, namely the Kohanim, the priests and their service. We're leaving that off, and this Torah portion begins with the concept of the Shemitah, the Sabbatical year, and all of its laws. And we are reminded, of a sudden, of Mount Sinai, where this law, and indeed all the laws of the Torah, were given to Israel by God. The name of our parsha is Behar. The word literally means in the mountain. Really, the parsha should be referred to as Behar Sinai, because those are the opening words of the Torah portion. As we open, we read, Hashem spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai, and he gave over all of these laws. He said, speak to the children of Israel, give over these laws of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, which, by the way, was just observed last year here in Israel. And as we read here in chapter 25, during the sabbatical year, the land is to observe a Shabbat, a Sabbath, as it were, is not to be worked. And we read, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath rest for Hashem. For 6 years you may sow your field, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard, and you may gather in your crop. But the 7th year shall be a complete rest for the land, a Sabbath for Hashem. Your field you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune. So as we mentioned, Parasha begins with Mount Sinai. The verse tells us that God spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai and told him to speak to the children of Israel and tell them all about the sabbatical year. And Rashi, the important commentator, asks a very famous rhetorical question. He says, what's the sabbatical year got to do with Mount Sinai? Meaning, as he explains in his commentary, we already know that the entire Torah was given at Mount Sinai, not only this commandment. So why does the Torah here interject the extra words preceding this commandment that God told Moshe this commandment at Mount Sinai? We haven't needed to be reminded of that since the event occurred back in the book of Exodus. So it's as if Rashi is saying, is there a particularly special connection between the sabbatical year and Mount Sinai more than any other mitzvah? And Rashi answers his rhetorical question just as famously, stating, this is to teach us that just as the commandment of Shemitah, just as the commandment of the sabbatical year was given at Mount Sinai, including all of its general principles, as well as its precise details and minute instructions, so too, he says, all of the Torah's commandments, with all their principles and details, were given at Mount Sinai. Okay. Now, that the land maybe needs to rest every once in a while. Tell me every 7 years, okay. From an agricultural standpoint, maybe I could understand. But calling it a Sabbath, conveying the idea that just as the nation of Israel is commanded to observe the Sabbath in time to sanctify God and to bear witness His creation of existence, so too the land of Israel is also commanded to sanctify God and to bear witness to His creation of itself? No. The land is not commanded. Israel is commanded to sanctify God by letting the land rest. But this is interesting because last week in our discussion, Parashat Emor, we spoke about the distinct dimensions of time and space and their confluence. We emphasize that really, in the root of all things, in the reality of Hashem, it's all the same. It's all the same. It's all absolutely one thing. So, for the land to observe a Sabbath also strikes us as some sort of blending of time and space. The element of the sanctity of time is here interjected or transferred onto the plane of the earth, space, as God commands the land to observe a Sabbath year. Certainly sounds like a prescription for the physical to be made spiritual. So, can that be? So here you have to open up your heart in the deepest way. Hear what's really going on here. Within the physical plane of existence, there are spiritual paths. But we conceal them with our density. And sometimes it seems we do our best to conceal the spiritual reality. And only we can reveal them. That's why Hashem made the world, that He left it up to us to reveal His presence. So the world, and I mean the physical world, is actually godliness. It's only Hashem. He's really the stuff of reality. The life force of God is in everything. And this is the meaning of the Midrashic statement that Hashem created the world through the Torah. The Midrash states, He looked into the Torah, which of course is a manifestation of His will. He looked into it and created the world. So if we look into the Torah also, we are to find Him, but also if we would look into this world, we would find Him. So now, there are different levels of time and physical reality, space, but everything, this very world, is imbued with godliness. It's really right here, in the physicality, all around us, but it's covered over, and we have to seek it. It's just that everything is covered over. And speaking of the agricultural motif of the beginning of our parsha, don't you cover over the seed with the earth and life springs forth? But basically, where is this most manifest? Because it's not all the same. Not everything is the same. The revelation of godliness in physicality, in earthiness, is the land of Israel. That is the equation. Revelation of godliness in physicality equals the land of Israel. So listen, a deeper meaning, a deeper level of meaning of what Rashi is really saying, his question and answer, is not so simple. Why is Shemitah mentioned, particularly next to Mount Sinai? What he really means on a whole other level is this. The sabbatical year is mentioned in particular in connection with Mount Sinai because this is the clearest, truest, boldest, most obvious connection to Sinai, to everything that Sinai means. What is the concept of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, doing next to Mount Sinai? When we say Mount Sinai, we mean the Sinai revelation, which is an idea, not just an event. It's a concept that's so profound and so meaningful in every generation that it's the basis of everything. Because the Sinai revelation teaches us that God, revealing Himself and presenting Israel with the Torah on Mount Sinai, holiday of Shavuot, right, coming up very soon as we count these days of the Omer that we're involved with right now. That event, the Sinai revelation, is more than an event. It's a concept that means that God not only would meet man, but that He wants to, that He's concerned with, that He cares about this world, that He can be found in this world, that He wants His Torah to be in this world, that He's to be sought out and recognized in this world, that He can be served in this world, that this world, the land, the very artsiyut means the physicality, the earthiness itself is a reflection of and subject to godliness. And so even more so, this is the real, most truest manifestation of God being intimately involved with this world. Shemitah, the sabbatical year, how when we keep His commandments and show this faith in Him, and of course on the simple level, as we all know, it's a test of faith, the sabbatical year, as God tells us in these verses. You might say, when are we going to eat? We're not going to have anything to eat. He says, no, you're going to have enough for the 6th year, the 7th year, the 8th year. But when we keep these commandments and show this faith in Him, we are literally infusing earthiness with godliness. And speaking of the counting of the Omer, a commandment of spiritual growth that we are occupied with right now during these days, based on a commandment found in Parashat Behar, in Leviticus 23, to count for yourselves 7 complete weeks from Passover to Shavuot. Does that pattern in time seem familiar from this week's Torah portion? In this week's Torah portion, we read, here in chapter 25, beginning in verse 8. You shall count for yourselves 7 cycles of sabbatical years, 7 years 7 times. The years of the 7 cycles of sabbatical years shall be for you 49 years. You shall sound a broken blast on the shofar. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, on the Day of Atonement, you shall sound the shofar throughout your land. You shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be the Jubilee year. For you shall return each man to his ancestral heritage. You shall return each man to his family. It shall be a Jubilee year for you, this 50th year. You shall not sow, you shall not harvest its aftergrowth, and you shall not pick what was set aside of it for yourself. For it is a Jubilee year. It shall be holy to you. From the field you may eat its crop. In this Jubilee year you shall return each man to his ancestral heritage. The whole idea of sanctifying time, not every day or month or year is the same. There are patterns and cycles in time and in our lives wherein we can seek Hashem. That's the design. What is all this emphasis of freedom? At the end of the cycle, the Jubilee year brings in freedom, breaks the spell of captivity that we are all under, and it sets us free. Counting the days and weeks of the Omer, 7 times 7 days equals 7 complete weeks. That's the microcosm of a certain plan, a certain vision, of God's vision for man's spiritual sensitivity and development, for being sensitive to a cycle of time that can set us free. Here we encounter the macro. 7 years times 7, and as Shavuot on the 50th day of the Omer cycle saw us receiving and sees us even now, receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, which truly sets man free, to recognize and acknowledge the Creator and live attached to Him and imbue artziut, physicality, earthiness with godliness. So too, we count 7 times 7 years, and the 50th year, a new illumination of freedom comes into the world, a Jubilee year, a year of holiness. And the freedom comes from the cycle itself, from living a life of looking in everything for godliness, from the cycle itself, which is a sanctification of time and life and our physical world. It's a year of return. This is all about recognizing, seeing the spiritual root of all things and allowing for a return, reclamation on the personal, national, and ultimately on the universal scale. Each man returns to his family, to his ancestral heritage. The land returns, and you proclaim freedom. You proclaim freedom? You have to declare it to be so. This is the whole thing. This is the thing. You count the years, you blow the shofar, you declare the freedom. I can understand that we are to search for the illumination of God and everything, but why is it up to Israel to declare the sabbatical and the Jubilee years? They're happening on their own. God is certainly counting. Is there something that we need to activate here? Is this an app that has to be turned on? Or this is something that we've learned before. We've encountered this idea together before. God's presence is shining forth from everything, but it's covered over, and remains so until we make the declaration, the admission, until we activate the search. Remember, we learned where this really comes from, and we've had occasion to mention this even fairly recently back in the book of Breshit. In the very, very beginning, chapter 2 of Breshit, we read about the creation of man. And we read here, and Hashem formed the man of dust from the ground, and he blew into his nostrils the soul of life, and man became a living being. And we discussed how these words, he breathed into him the soul of life, vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim, is translated as a speaking spirit. That the soul of life, the element of Hashem within him, is manifest by his ability to speak. And it doesn't just mean to speak, it means, what is he speaking? It's up to a person's ability to recognize God, to sanctify, to call out, just as we were told just last week in Parashat Behar. We read here regarding the necessity of Israel to declare the festivals. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Hashem's appointed festivals that you are to designate as holy convocations. These are my appointed festivals." Just like Israel calls out the festivals, literally calls out the festivals, and that's why the Jubilee has to be announced. What does it have to do with us? Why is it dependent on our verbalization? That's the Nishmat Chaim, Nishmat Chaim. That is the godly soul is manifest in our words that we bring back to God. And this is how a person awakens the godly life force in everything, by our speaking out for Hashem. So we see here that Israel is entrusted with the stewardship of these dimensions, of the confluence of the dimensions, entrusted with the Sabbatical and the Jubilee years in order to make a tikkun for all creation. This is why the sages emphasize that the proper observance of the Sabbatical year nullifies exile. It's so powerful that it nullifies the decree of exile, and that non-observance, desecration of the Sabbatical year is enough to prolong the exile. It causes the exile, galut. Why? Because the Shemitah Sabbatical year injects an illumination that comes from beyond time into time, and the earth shall rest. What does that mean? And the earth shall rest. It connects with its very life force. Observing the Shemitah in the land of Israel is a revelation of the godliness of all things, and that is what breaks the pattern of exile. That is what sets us free. That's what sets the captives free, as we just read regarding the Jubilee. The root and source of the rest of the land, of its rest, is the godliness that's found even in the physicality. And this godliness is in everything. It's up to a person to recognize it and declare it, to find it, or God forbid, to deny this life force in everything. Because even though everything is crying out Hashem's presence, every level of reality, the very earthiness itself, it depends on how we receive it. It depends on how we articulate it, verbalize it, recognize it. And the whole world is waiting for us to cry out that Hashem is here. And that is how we sanctify His presence. And that is how we reconnect everything to the root, to the source. And that is how we reveal the godliness in everything.